Does investment in a border wall make sense? I'm Simon Harrington, and this is Scholar's Mate. Hello and welcome to Scholar's Mate. I'm your host, Simon Harrington. The 2016 presidential campaign put a spotlight on the U.S. southern border. While everyone agrees that the border is porous, experts disagree about whether investing in border security would be effective in controlling illegal immigration and drug trafficking, or whether it would be counterproductive. Joining us to discuss the issue is Thad Bingel, a founding partner of Command Consulting Group. Most recently in government, he was Chief of Staff at U.S. Customs and Border Protection. He served as Assistant Commissioner for the Office of Congressional Affairs at CBP and as Majority Counsel with the U.S. House Judiciary Committee. And joining us via Skype is Douglas S. Massey, Henry G. Bryant Professor of Sociology and Public Affairs at Princeton University. He's the author of Climbing Mount Laurel, The Struggle for Affordable Housing and Social Mobility in an American Suburb, and Brokered Boundaries, Creating Immigrant Identity in Anti-Immigrant Times. He's currently president of the American Academy of Political and Social Sciences and past president of the American Sociological Association and the Population Association of America. Gentlemen, thank you both for joining us.
Thank you, Simon.
Professor.
Thank you.
So, Thad Bingel, you believe that strategic investments in border security would make sense. Can you please explain?
Sure, Simon. We know that investments the U.S. has made in border security in terms of infrastructure, people like Border Patrol agents, and technology, as well as things like air assets, have made a difference. We have studies that quantify that. We have anecdotal evidence as well in particular areas where we've deployed this type of infrastructure. For example, this began well before the current debate. Back in the 80s, with Operation Hold the Line and then Operation Gatekeeper, the Border Patrol then deployed fencing and additional people in El Paso and in San Diego, two areas that were very much out of control with illegal immigration. It made a notable impact, but at the time, given the limited resources, it pushed some of that traffic elsewhere, particularly Arizona. During the 2005 to 2007 period, was the next major investment in border infrastructure. We built, while I was at CBP, approximately 700 miles of fence. We doubled the size of the Border Patrol, and we deployed a lot of new technology ranging from unmanned aerial vehicles to additional helicopters to fixed detection systems. We've dropped from a peak of 1.7 million people who crossed the border illegally got away in 2005 before this last round of investment. Today it's a tenth of that, about 170,000 is the estimate now per year. Likewise, in terms of overall apprehensions and numbers that we were dealing with, we went from a peak of over, again, 1.7 million apprehensions by the Border Patrol back in the 2000 timeframe, down to almost a 80% reduction in that number today in fiscal year 2015. Now, there are larger economic trends as well. And I'll be the last one, as I hope anyone who's really familiar with border security is, to argue that a wall alone, such as we've heard in the presidential campaign, is a solution in itself. But it's one piece of a larger solution. And in some areas along the border, it's a critical piece of that solution. When you have highly urbanized areas on both sides of the border, the disappearance time for somebody who can cross the border unimpeded is literally seconds to minutes. There's no time to make an apprehension if they don't have to surmount some sort of physical barrier. In other areas where you're talking about 10,000-foot mountains, perhaps a fence on top of that is not the best investment of resources, where you can cover it with technology or people.
Okay, and Professor Massey, you've heard what Mr. Bingel had to say. How would you like to respond?
Well, border enforcement really didn't work in the past. The effect of border enforcement was actually to deter people from going home once they gained entry to Mexico, rather than to deter them from leaving in the first place or even getting across. The data that I've analyzed showed that the massive increase in border enforcement had no real effect on the probability of apprehension and no effect on the likelihood that someone would get in over the course of a number of attempts. And further investment in border security at this point, I think, is a waste of taxpayer money because illegal migration essentially ended 8 years ago, and the flow has been zero or negative ever since. And the reason illegal migration ended really didn't have anything to do with border enforcement. It's because of the aging of the Mexican population. Back in the 1960s, the average woman had about 6 or 7 children. Today, the average woman in Mexico has around 2.2, 2.3 children per woman, and that's roughly at replacement level. Mexico is becoming an aging society. The average age of people at risk of migrating to the United States keeps rising and rising, and migration is a very age-dependent phenomenon. If you don't leave between the ages of 16 and 30, you're very unlikely to start migrating above the age of 30. And the average age in Mexico today is 28 years old. And so Mexico is basically aging out of the migrant-prone years. And we've seen from Mexico alone, the flow has actually been slightly negative. The only reason it hovers around zero is because of Central Americans. And basically, they're the only traffic left on the border. The border is already the most secure border anywhere in the world, with possible exception of the Korean DMZ. So I don't think any more money spent is going to get us any more security. Imagine that you own a house and you have in Mexico border. The Mexican border is the front of your house. The Canadian border is the back of your house, and the oceans on each side are the walls of your house. Well, if you already have an iron fence on the front of your house, and that's foolproof, pretty protected for getting in, but you don't have anything on either side, and you basically have a largely undefended border north, more money spent on that one wall isn't going to get you any more security. I think more security would be achieved through tighter visa controls, more internal controls, and frankly, we should pay a little more attention to the Canadian border.
Thad, so Professor Massey is saying that the border is no longer necessary, that the immigration is actually a negative number now. How would you respond to that?
Well, he's right in terms of the changes in the Mexican population and economy that have been a major contributing factor to that reduction. However, he mentioned we also still have migrants from other countries attempting to get in, particularly Central American, and the flow and the direction they go is, again, from Mexico. And while we've worked cooperatively with those nations in the hemisphere, and particularly Mexico, to try to reduce that, it's still a major problem. You know, South Texas, in the last couple fiscal years, we've seen the kind of inundation with everything from unaccompanied minors to family units, but regular types of economic migrants that we've traditionally seen from Central American countries, young males as well. If migrants were the only problem we were dealing with on the southern border, it might make more sense to, as the professor said, pay attention to our other borders, which does need to be done. But we are still dealing with a significant problem with narcotics cartels, and we're still dealing with the threat of terrorists. The routes for people to be smuggled into this country, as well as dangerous things, from narcotics to weapons, are well established on our southern border. We have a cooperative relationship with Mexico, but it doesn't approach the level of intelligence sharing and cooperation we enjoy with Canada. I will agree with the professor on our coastal borders are still something that needs to be addressed. There are significant threats from that direction that we've made comparatively little investment in. So I would agree with him on that.
Okay, Professor. The argument that Thad Bingel made about the drugs coming over the border, how would you propose that we stop that if not for the war?
Well, the problem with drugs is they're actually quite popular in America, and a lot of people want to consume them. And it's really a demand-driven phenomenon. And study after study shows that interdiction really doesn't work. Drugs are as available and as cheap as they've ever been right now, so treatment and education are much more logical and realistic ways of trying to deal with the demand side. As long as the demand's there, it's going to be very lucrative for somebody to try to smuggle drugs in, and building a wall just poses another challenge, but there are many ways to get into the United States besides crossing the Mexico-U.S. border, and narcotics gangs have lots of resources at their disposal, so they can hire planes, they can hire boats, they can build tunnels, they can do anything practically, because there's so much profit in it, and building a wall and enhancing more border enforcement is just going to push them to different avenues for getting the product into where the demand is.
Okay, and so how do you want to respond to that as far as, how do you have another solution to stopping the drugs, or how if it's not for the wall? Or?
Well, the solution is you make it more difficult to get in, whatever the contraband is, whether, again, it's illegal persons or narcotics or weapons or terrorists. I don't think the solution is to just give up on border enforcement or say we've done enough. If 50% of the people trying to get in are now apprehended, there's still 50% that we're not getting, and that's an investment of resources to crank that number down. I would say this, no one expects, much like a major city could have zero crime. A realistic number is not getting to zero on our southern border or any of our borders. But 50%, I think most of the American people and most of the people in law enforcement would agree is too high of a number. That's not enough success, in enforcing our border, in particular our southern border. But we have a lot of other holes to address. The professors mentioned several of them. Ultimately, if we really are serious about getting control of illegal immigration, we're not going to wait it out in terms of demographics, because that will take years. You also have maybe 50% of the people who are here illegally did not sneak across the border in the first place. They came here in some legal status and overstayed. So a wall, I will say, I agree with the professor, a wall does nothing about that part of the population. That's a combination of better visa controls, worksite enforcement, a number of interior enforcement initiatives that are mostly in current law. It's just that we don't invest the resources and we don't make the effort there for various political reasons. But none of that is addressed by building a wall across the southern border. That only keeps out the other 50% that sneak across.
How would you suggest one of the issues that is a concern to Americans at this point is the terrorism threat? How would you propose that we question or verify who's coming into this country as far as a terrorist?
Well, it's impossible to find out everything about everyone who enters and leaves the country. If you're in a global economy, people are coming and going, and really the best defense is good human intelligence, good signal intelligence, and we're doing that. And the United States has actually been relatively effective, I think, in protecting the homeland from security threats. And most of the recent attacks are from homegrown terrorists, and strict immigration policy wouldn't even help them because they grew up here or were born here. So I think walls don't help. Good human intelligence with people infiltrating these groups, good signal intelligence where you're capturing data from telephone conversations and computers and internet and so on. That's what we're doing, and that seems to be the most effective at this point.
Do you agree with this line?
It's absolutely a big part of the solution. And most of the people we know who we have an interest in for terrorism reasons, when we encounter them at the border, the majority of them are encountered at our airports still. But we are encountering some on our southern border as well as the Canadian border. There's also the unknowns, which is the trickiest challenge. Those who are not on any database or any watch list as a noted terrorism suspect, but people who have perhaps taken evasive maneuvers to hide their travel patterns, like foreign fighters who are leaving to fight in Ethiopia or Syria or Iraq, and are now returning to their home countries. This is a much bigger problem for Western Europe right now in terms of sheer numbers, but it's still a problem we're very much concerned about here and ought to be. And again, we have to do the things the professor suggested, but One of the concerns that has been present in recent years is we have seen an uptick of aliens apprehended from non-traditional countries, particularly special interest countries, those in the Middle East and North Africa, on our southern border. That's of concern because they have obviously figured that they're not getting through the airports as easily. They really aren't getting through at all because of a number of the programs that we've put in place and because of the advanced information we demand in the air environment. So it is still an attractive potential route for would-be terrorists or just from an illegal alien from a country other than Mexico or Central America to try the southern border still because of still having essentially a coin flip chance of success given the lack of infrastructure that we still need there.
All right, let's take some questions from our viewers. Our first question comes from Renee Ward, who would like to know, if we build the wall, won't the traffickers just build a ladder or something to bypass the wall? How do we prevent the immigrants from bypassing the wall?
Sure. And this is really a common misconception out there that, again, that a wall by itself is any type of solution. Where we have the most robust infrastructure, say, for example, outside of San Diego, where we have triple layer fencing, lighting, patrol roads in the middle, very significant obstacles, we still face attempts to circumvent that fence. The people who are involved in human smuggling and narcotic smuggling are fairly ingenious, and they have done everything from build very sophisticated tunnels under the fence. They've done things like pneumatic air cannons, firing big coffee cans full of drugs over the fence. They've used ultralight vehicles and drones to drop things over the fence. And they've tried to cut the fence a number of times. If you take a drive along that same section outside of San Diego, you'll see all of the cut attempts and the repairs that constantly have to be made to the fence there. And that would be true for any section of fence along the border. It is a barrier that buys you time. It does not actually stop people by itself. It gives your response resources time to detect and then apprehend or deter that person from crossing. But if left unguarded, for those who watch Game of Thrones, the wall in itself is a barrier, but without the Night's Watch on top, it's still able to be circumvented. You either can climb over it or go underneath it or go around it. So it's one piece or one tool in the toolkit, one quiver, one arrow in the quiver, but by itself, your viewer's right. It's not a solution. It could be circumvented given enough time and resources if you're unable to enforce with your people adequately and your technology.
Okay, Professor Massey, Sean Day would like to know, how would you suggest we deal with the southern border?
Well, I think the southern border is pretty much dealt with. It's probably the most secure border anywhere in the world. It's certainly one of the most militarized. We spend $4 billion a year in border enforcement. The number of apprehensions is really at a 40 or 50-year low. The traffic across the border is minimal at this point. I think we've done about all we can, and more people are now coming in on regular visas and not across the border. So in the undocumented population, the proportion of people who are what are called visa abusers is rising. And further investments in the southern border is not going to get us much additional security and not going to do very much to prevent additional undocumented migration. We've already got more than enough on that border, and we should focus our efforts internally with, I think, a verifiable employment system where everybody has to give a number, or everybody's given a card with a magnetic strip that an employer can simply read into a computer to see and get an authorization code back. The technology would be very easy to do.
I would agree that most of the money ought not to be invested in a wall across the entire border. I do think there are still significant holes that need to be filled with detection technology in particular, and perhaps a deployment of mobility assets like aircraft in particular to have the rapid response that you need to get to these remote areas and to see what's going on there. Because 20,000 Border Patrol agents, overall sounds like a lot. even with 90% of those deployed on the southern border, when you think about it in terms of how many are actually working on a particular shift, that's still pretty thin along that 3,000 mile border. To maximize the effectiveness of the resources we do have, they need to be out of the business of trying to detect, with eyeballs, the people who are crossing that they need to apprehend, and they need a rapid way to get to them. And those are the investments I'd like to see still made, along with many of the things the professor mentions in terms of our interior enforcement and worksite enforcement systems.
Okay, and now it's time for Answer This, where each guest asks a question directly to the other. Who would like to go first? Professor Massey, why don't we just have you go first?
Okay. I would like to know why we spend so much time and energy on the southern border and put so little effort into the northern border. Mexico has no large Islamic populations. It doesn't really have any known terrorist cells, whereas Canada has large Islamic populations in its cities and known terrorist cells that have been convicted in federal court for attempting to enter the United States for terrorist purposes. And yet all the attention is placed on the southern border and very little attention is placed on the northern border. And I want to know why.
I don't know that I have a complete answer for that, because a lot of the answer is political. And in some ways, like many other times, we're sort of still fighting the last war to a degree. There are very real concerns about the southern border dating back to the early to mid-90s through the pre-9/11 timeframe. And I think our context of viewing the border as average citizens or even elected officials is still very much impacted by what was taking place 10 years ago, more so even than recent progress that's been made. He's right on the terrorism side that perhaps, although the Canadians bristle at this, perhaps a greater threat is resident there on the northern border. I again come back to, I think one of the challenges, the investments we've made there are not as visible. Things like cooperative intelligence sharing with the Canadians, things like the advanced information we now require, and the fact that we've now instituted a passport requirement on all travelers between the United States and Canada that didn't exist 15 years ago. Those things don't get as much notice in terms of their effect on security and the information sharing that we do, while things like a wall and more Border Patrol agents on the southern border are very visible things that are very easy to grab onto, and
Sure.
I think that explains some of it.
Okay, and Thad Bingel, what would your question be for the professor?
I guess my question to you would be, even looking at just the studies that you were referring to that go back a number of years in terms of the illegal migrant population. Certainly within that, you would note are a number who did successfully sneak across the border. It's hard to get past the fact for me that some of the notable decline in that cannot all be tied to economics and demographics. Some of it, at least, both from interviews we've done in the agency with migrants who are coming, note the deterrent effect that it is harder to get across now. And things like lateral or interior repatriation, which are another thing that we haven't talked about, actually can be effective in deterring people from making the second and third attempt. So my question is, would you address that at least for some migrants, being caught and returned is a significant deterrent than never being caught at all?
I think that is certainly true today. It's a very unpleasant experience crossing the border, whether you get in or not. And if you're apprehended, it's an even more unpleasant experience. But today, there are very few people who are actually motivated even to start migrating to the United States. So it's kind of a moot point if you're deterring a very small number of people as compared to the large cohorts of migrants that were trying to get into the United States 15 or 20 years ago. The number trying to get in now are very small. And a lot of the traffic on the border is actually from people that we've deported from the United States, trying to get back in to rejoin their families who remain north of the border. So I just don't think that further investments in border enforcement are going to bias very much in the global sense of things.
All right, and now it's time for We Agree, where each guest names something the other said that he agrees with. Thad, we'll start with you on this one.
All right, I agree with Professor Massey that if you assume a finite pot of resources that we can invest on border security and effective immigration controls, that a lot of that investment should not be in a wall on the southern border. It really should be in things like worksite enforcement and an easy to use and mandatory employment verification system. We have the seeds of that with E-Verify. It hardly gets any attention, it seems, in the political debate. But again, to address the people who are already here, which, as the professor has noted, is really a much more significant part of the illegal immigrant population than those who are currently sneaking across. A wall on the border does nothing to address the people already here in illegal status. So that should be the focus of some of our resource investment, and maybe the lion's share of it.
And perhaps the political debate.
And perhaps of the political debate.
Professor Massey, what would you like to agree with that Mr. Bingel said? Bingel?
Well, I agree with Mr. Bingel that our goal shouldn't be zero apprehensions and zero traffic and 100% along the border. It's already down to very, very low levels, and we disagree about the mix of causes that have brought about the current state of affairs. But at this point, the traffic on the southern border is actually the smallest it's been in decades, and so further investments there I don't think are warranted. So we both agree that 100% is not the goal. It's really kind of managing it and creating deterrence and discouraging people from coming, and we've achieved that. We both agree that internal enforcement is probably going to be more effective than border enforcement going forward, and that a wall is probably a very bad, or at least not a smart investment of resources, given the current state of things along the border.
Okay, that's all we have time for. We'd like to thank Thad Bingel of Command Consulting Group and Douglas Massey of Princeton University for joining us to discuss this issue.
Thank you, Simon.
Thank you, Simon. It was a pleasure engaging in a civilized discussion.
And thank you for watching Scholars Mate. I'm Simon Harrington, and we'll see you next time.